three. Here we go. And more people are joining. So welcome everyone who is here on the call today. Thank you for joining. This is a TUED Global Forum. My name is Irene Hongping Shen, and I work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. We're here today to discuss Working Paper 14, Beyond Disruption, how reclaimed utilities can help cities meet their climate goals. We have interpretation in French and Spanish. So for speakers, if you could speak slowly and clearly into your microphone, that will help make the interpretation accessible. We have an exciting agenda today. We'll start with Sean giving introduction and presentation on Working Paper 14 with some of the key points, and then we will hear from three respondents today. And I'm excited to say that they're all women on the panel today, an unusual TUED occurrence, but we have someone from PSI, Sandra van Nieuwkerk, in South Africa, and then we're going to hear from Lavinia Steinfort from TNI, the Transnational Institute, and lastly from Sam Mason, who is with Public and Commercial Services in the UK. And then we're going to open for discussion. So look forward to hearing from everybody, and let's get started. I'm going to hand over to you, Sean.
Great, thanks, Irene. And just a word of welcome from me before we ask Erin to put the first slide up. Actually, you can do that now, Erin, if that's okay. Sorry to be a bit confused. So we're here to discuss Working Paper 14. This was a tough paper to write. John Treat and I co-wrote this paper. It took quite a while to do it because we were trying to make sense of a lot of the data and try to come to terms with some of the questions that have been unanswered from previous discussions. But the motive, let me start with the motivation behind the paper. Like everybody else, we've been very excited by efforts at the city level of cities to take back public services. Remunicipalization is one of the words that has been used, and there's been quite a lively debate over what cities can do in the context of trying to take public services back from the private sector or to expand existing public services. And we noted that there had been a lot of efforts for cities on the question of energy to play a progressive role in the fight against climate change, and also to basically decarbonize cities and to try to lend support for that agenda. What, of course, the paper tried to do is also highlight that there is a big business agenda here as well, which I think Andrew Cumbers or another progressive scholar called urban neoliberalism, which has a very anti-public agenda, and that's dealt with in the paper. So there's sort of dangers here, or we thought there were dangers in terms of some degree of narrative overlap. Let me explain what I mean by that. Basically, the idea of disrupting the large energy companies is often used by urban neoliberal thinkers as opening the door to new markets and also privatizing what's left of the regulated and even public side of energy, of the energy systems. So we felt that also our experience in recent years with TUED, and I'll come to that in a moment, around the UK and the Labour Party debates, later on South Africa and Mexico. So I want to touch on that in terms of the political significance of this discussion in our view. So next slide, please, Erin. Right, so this is from the introduction, and I'm trying to underscore this point early before attention span weakens. And what we've suggested here, that it's a serious mistake to regard the incumbent companies as a lost cause. And the incumbent companies are really the large energy companies, many of whom have been privatized, marketized, and behave now as multinationals in many cases. But they still produce the vast majority of electricity in the world today. And the idea of going around them or disrupting them, we felt was a mistake, and that we should focus on those companies with a clear public ownership agenda. And I'll come back to one or two of those points later on. This does, though, connect with the whole idea of cities adopting climate targets. Many cities have talked about achieving zero carbon by 2050. Some have talked about 100% renewable energy within a similar time frame, if not sooner. And so this cities have asserted themselves on the global stage as leaders of the climate, of the fight against climate change. We sort of take those claims apart in the paper a little bit to, again, separate the stated aims of cities with alongside their actual accomplishments, which is the same in the case of countries as well. They make ambitious statements about what they're going to do by 2030, 2040, but as TUED has documented on numerous occasions, those targets are rarely met. In fact, I would say they're never met. Next slide, please, Erin. So one of the things that I think has influenced the debate on cities and also influenced the left is a rather exaggerated view of the potential of distributed generation. Now, this is a picture of a leading social democrat, now deceased, Hermann Scheer, who has been credited as being the sort of the main policy designer of Germany's Energiewende, or energy transition. So he's a very significant person. And in terms of shaping this view that because there is a renewable energy technologies, wind and solar, but particularly solar, are so flexible, and the sun is so plentiful, and wind turbines are small, and the wind is so what's the word I'm looking for? Universal and everywhere, that because there's so much energy, that these technologies could meet the world's energy needs in a very short period of time. And Scheer, and John Treek took the lead on investigating the legacy of Scheer. And his influence, I think, cannot be understated. He was talking about it being it's resolved. There are no issues. Scientists and engineers all agree that the energy transition is not only going to be driven by renewables, but because of the nature of the technologies, their size and their flexibility, their small size, they could be pretty much anywhere in cities, in communities, and they will provide more than enough electricity. And this, when we looked into it, it was kind of, where is the evidence? Like, what's the sort of empirical basis for these claims? And it was quite striking and shocking even that how little there was to substantiate this view. So, but this led to a certain opinion getting sort of into the progressive discourse in Europe in particular, but it spread globally. And that is the sort of the idea that their distributed generation had unlimited potential, and that producers and citizens could be taking charge of the whole energy transition from below. Next slide, please, Erin. So part of the debate that unfolded was that the old model, and you can see it in the back of this picture here, which I stole from the internet today, is the old centralized coal, gas, nuclear power systems were no longer necessary, and they would soon be obsolete, and that the new wind, solar in particular, would replace those that old business model, that old technology. Next slide, please, Erin. So the kind of view, I think, that was across the environmental movement and some sections of the progressive movement was that the incumbent companies were they were sort of, their days were numbered. So the large energy companies would basically go the way of the dinosaurs. In fact, they've been often described as dinosaurs, just with no longer fit for purpose in terms of the energy transition. This view became entrenched maybe a decade or longer ago, but it's still around today. I just came back from South Africa, where the whole debate is on how the public utility Eskom is not fit for purpose. It is too large, it is too unwieldy, and there's other new forms of energy generation, particularly renewables, that are rapidly drawing the curtain down on these large centralized systems. Next slide, please, Erin. Now, politically, it unfolds in a lot of interesting ways. This is a great writer on energy, John Farrell, whose NGO, I can't remember what it's called now. I think it's Center for, anyway, apologies for forgetting. But the debate over renewables versus fossil fuels has become a debate between the small, decentralized power generation and large companies that are still largely using fossil fuels. And the narrative in a lot of the global north is there's the good guys and the bad guys here are the incumbent companies because they don't like renewables. They like big projects, they like fossil fuels, and accompanying this sort of depiction of the large energy companies is the notion that they are largely concerned with profits and that they really just want to carry on with the status quo. They are indifferent about climate change. This is a very convenient narrative in a sense, because it then reinforces the idea that we've got to go to a decentralized direction. We've got to support renewables against fossil fuels. Now, let me I emphasize that the paper did not take the view that the large energy companies are somehow saints that have been misunderstood by the progressive debates and the progressive forces internationally. Not at all. You know, many of these large companies embrace privatization with great enthusiasm. The top CEOs made a lot of money being head of private companies as opposed to publicly regulated companies. So this is not a question of a misunderstanding. And many of those privatized and marketized companies have gone on to be pretty voracious multinationals. So the issue is not, are they good or not bad? The issue is what role are they playing in the energy systems right now? Next slide, please. Now, what the paper also tries to do is to revisit the question of the impact of neoliberal reforms from the 1980s and 90s. The rules for public and regulated companies changed. If they weren't privatized, they were marketized. In other words, they had to compete in electricity markets. They had to sell electrons volumetrically. In other words, you sell as much electricity as you can. And that in many ways explains why the large energy companies have done their utmost to cut off any competition as much as they can. So along comes behind the meter solar producers, small companies producing their own wind and solar. And that is a threat to the market share of these large companies. To us, in our analysis in TUED, the question of what the fuel source is secondary. The main issue is the question of the market rules that compel all companies to purportedly compete in this market. Now, what we've documented in other working papers, particularly the Preparing a Public Pathway and others since then, is the energy markets now are basically, and this is a global phenomenon, they're not competitive markets. They're largely power purchase agreements. It's a money spinner for private companies, and all forms of energy are heavily subsidized now, including coal, gas, and nuclear, but so are wind and solar. So we've got ourselves into a policy quagmire that the neoliberal model sort of precipitated in terms of its goals of trying to reach climate targets within a neoliberal market setting has ended up being a policy disaster, which we've documented quite thoroughly in our papers for TUED. So we feel that this was important in the paper to draw attention to the impact of the neoliberal reforms and, by extension, the need to repeal those laws and to reestablish public control and ownership over the large companies, and to mandate that they operate with a new public mission, which would be to drive an energy transition in a socially equitable way. Next slide, please. So the main arguments for the paper, I'll just review these quickly because nobody likes to see bullet points like this. We sense that within the left, there's a need to reclaim and to focus on the reclaiming of the large companies to public ownership, that the idea of disrupting those companies, where some progressives have thought that's a good idea and we can make some progress, particularly at city level, by disrupting their markets, trying to undercut them in some way, that this is actually pretty much a neoliberal mechanism or tool to basically remove the idea of universal supply of electricity to everybody with regulated pricing so that everybody gets access to electricity, and to basically take any legacy of public energy out of the picture altogether. Again, referring to South Africa, we see the forces of the independent power producers in South Africa talking now about breaking up the utility completely in order to allow private consumers, and that includes companies, to source their own electricity from private producers. So it's done in the name of climate protection and in the name of advancing equality. So we try to draw attention to some of these dangers. The paper also goes into some detail about the distributed generation, contrary to what Scheer was asserting 15 or so years ago. Even if a lot of cities put solar systems on all the roofs within their cities, for example, it would probably only contribute a fraction of the electricity needed during the course of a year. Won't go into that detail now, but it's remarkable, again, I emphasize this point, how little has been written on the technical capacities of distributed generation, particularly in cities. So this, I think, does alter conceptions of energy sovereignty, of how municipal authorities might get their electricity. If it's limited within their own geographical space, then it raises a question about the importance of controlling the whole system in order to drive a decarbonization agenda. We also showed that the utility scale projects are growing much faster than the behind the meter projects. This is now becoming a global phenomenon. And so the large energy companies are essentially moving into the renewables market. And so they can do coal, they can do gas and renewables and still make money. And that's why we need to take them back into public ownership. And on a positive note, we feel that these arguments are really, can really reinforce the great work that's being done around the sort of remunicipalization of cities, of trying to reclaim public services. Not that remunicipalization can solve energy needs for cities, but they can create a political platform where the case for comprehensive reclaiming of the large energy companies becomes much stronger if cities can weigh in on that. And the possibility of public-public partnerships between municipalities and reclaimed companies is very real, and not just sort of an abstract idea, but it could actually happen, and we're seeing it in 1 or 2 places around the world. Next slide, please, Erin. So I just want to refer to a couple of why this is an important discussion. As many of you will know, TUED was very involved with the effort by Jeremy Corbyn to develop to reassert public ownership of vital services, and we were very involved with the energy discussions with the then Shadow Minister, Rebecca Long-Bailey, whose picture is here. And they produced a document called Bringing Energy Home, which in our view was very, very, very strong on public ownership. But it basically took the view that there was no need to renationalize the generation of electricity, that there was a sense that because coal, gas, and nuclear their days were numbered as sources of electricity, then why would we bother to renationalize it? Let's just control the grids. There was also, next slide, please, Erin. There was also, this is from the Cooperative Party in the UK, which is part of the Labour Party. It's been part of the Labour Party for 125 years. So the Cooperative Party, you can see there in clear language, policies on the debate of public ownership, policies which support and enable a greater number of larger scale community cooperatives and municipal energy projects to start up and succeed is a more appropriate solution to public ownership in this sector, that being the power sector. So the influence of sort of community energy and distributed generation and all that that implies, it was very strong in the debate over the Labour Party's energy future and made it into the manifesto of the Labour Party, which Labour wasn't elected, but had Labour been elected, I think we would be having a different discussion now about what renationalisation would have looked like under a Corbyn administration in the UK. So next slide, please. We also see, and this was pointed out in our working paper on community energy in Europe, that the idea that community energy has the power to drive the energy transition. We felt that that was a mistake, but it also led to political miscalculations where, because the European Union in its
si son de ahí, pero tiene que ser diversos oficios. Sí, digo, en la torre.
I'm sorry, I'm almost done. I think that was just a crosswire there. So the idea was that the community energy forces, some forces in the community energy movement were quite happy with the third energy package of the European Union because it carved out space for community energy projects. We dealt with that before, and I don't think there's any need to repeat that, but it's still politically significant that we get it right in terms of our orientation towards the large energy companies. Next slide, please. And this was a debate we had at the meeting with Rebecca Long-Bailey, where I drafted an essay called All or Something towards comprehensive reclaiming of the UK power sector, which was the sort of forerunner for this paper, really, and for the previous working paper on community energy, where we made the case that you cannot leave generation to the private companies. You cannot rely too much on community-based projects to drive the transition. We needed a comprehensive approach to energy systems and energy companies. Next slide, please. Almost done. In other contexts, don't have time to go into them now. This analysis is being used by TUED in South Africa with the Eskom Transform project with the Mine Workers Union and Metal Workers NUMSA NUM in partnership with Transnational Institute and AIDC, where we talked about the role of a modern utility to drive the energy transition and to reestablish planning. And then there's in Spanish, the title of a piece on Mexico, which basically supports Mexico's effort to try to reassert public ownership over the power system, in particular through the electricity grid, the utility CFE. Next slide. So we won't have time to go into detail, but the paper does in its final section talk about the whys of reclaiming energy companies to public control. And we don't have time to go into it now, and I'm sure the respondents will have a word or two to say about that. But there's such a compelling case, we believe, for a comprehensive reclaiming approach to the large energy companies, to the public pathway approach. It may sound more complicated and more difficult than perhaps trying to support other projects or other initiatives, but we feel it's absolutely essential if cities are going to reach their targets, and if the planet, I guess, is going to reach the sort of where it needs to go in terms of decarbonizing power and driving an energy transition forward in a way that can deal with some of the technical challenges that are going to be confronted along the way as we get towards a more climate-friendly global political economy. So thank you. I'll stop there. Sorry if I went on a little bit too long, and I'll ask Erin to get rid of my PowerPoint.
Great, thank you, Sean. It's a great to hear about the history of how the history of neoliberal energy policy has actually framed the development and evolution of the players in the current energy system, and their current roles, and definitely emphasis on the need for us all to understand more about the technical aspects of these energy systems and how they play into what kinds of models we should be looking into in the transition. So let's move over to the respondents now. We'll start with Sandra Van Niekerk. She's the project coordinator at Public Services International in South Africa. And PSI, as many of you know, has been a longtime ally and supporter of public energy. And Sandra herself, I think, has worked on various projects, including some around community energy. And we look forward to hearing from her. Sandra, can you make a noise so we can spotlight you?
Hi, yes.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, awesome.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks, Irene, and thanks, Sean. It was a very useful overview of your paper and some very nice pictures there. I wanted to start off by just saying that TUED has played an incredibly important role in emphasizing the importance and centrality of utilities as drivers of the transition to renewable energy. And I think it's an emphasis that needed to be made. And I think it's work that needed to be done because, as Sean has so aptly shown, the sort of national public energy utilities have been sort of steadily undermined in the public discourse for a very long time. So I think it's an important initiative that TUED has taken in highlighting the role of the national utilities. In relation to this specific paper, I actually think that you sell yourself a little bit short at the beginning of the paper when you talk about the fact that you're going to put forward an alternative approach, and you talk about that alternative approach as one that shifts attention away from the disruption of the incumbent companies towards the need to focus on the reclaiming of those companies. And I'm saying you're selling yourself short because what you start doing towards the end of the paper, which I think is really useful and really important, is to begin to look at the role of the national utilities in relation to what is happening in cities and in municipalities and a range of other actors, and the kind of partnerships or cooperative approach, as you talk about it, between all these different electricity generators that have now come onto the scene. And I think for me, that is where our focus should really be, is how the interplay between all these different actors happens, and how we can integrate what the national utility does, what the cities and municipalities are able to do in order to achieve what I think should be our aim, which is to increase access to electricity. And yeah, perhaps what we need to be talking about in the terminology you use is a sort of an integrated system between national utilities and progressive decommodified municipalism, or something like that. I just wanted to comment briefly on terminology, because I think different experiences and different realities in different countries make it quite difficult for us to have a common understanding of what different terminologies mean. So, you know, when we talk about cities, in a country like South Africa, we only have a handful of cities, but we have wall-to-wall municipalities. So municipalities and cities are not the same thing, but they both have a key role to play in terms of ensuring access to basic services for their residents. So sometimes I think, you know, we talk about cities as though we're talking about municipalities. Cities, by implication, have a great deal more in terms of resources, political power, access to finances, etc. And I think, yeah. So let me just note that point. I'll come back to it just now. I think the other point I wanted to make, that renewable energy, I don't think in and of itself is progressive, although obviously it does reduce carbon emissions. So maybe in that, but as a technology, if you think about it as a technology, no technology in and of itself is progressive or regressive. It's what you do with that technology and how you use that technology. And I think that is absolutely true with renewable energy. And I think so that is an important point to remember, where we're thinking about where to locate generation and how to ensure you know, that access to electricity is increased. But having said all that, I do want to say that I agree very strongly with Sean's emphasis on utilities driving the process. So while we need a cooperative or a partnership between all the different elements, you know, at national and local government level, we do need, I think, utilities to be able to drive the process of the transition to renewable energy. And I think we need the national utilities to drive that process for two reasons, both in relation to access and reducing electricity inequalities, and for reducing carbon emissions. And I think Sean's spoken a lot about the role that utilities need to play in reducing carbon emissions. Perhaps there's less emphasis on the role that national utilities play in increasing access to electricity, and why it's so important to have national utilities. So if we focus a little bit on access to electricity, energy poverty, inequitable access is a major issue across the African continent, and, you know, in many parts of the world. And it's not only about not being able to pay for electricity, it's about not being on the grid. So even in cities, informal houses don't have access to electricity, are not on the grid. That's true also of peri-urban areas and rural areas. And I think because of inequitable access, because of energy poverty, we can't leave it to kind of local level renewable energy projects, because that's not going to solve the problem of inequitable access. To me, in order to ensure that there's a national plan, there's national redistribution, there's national kind of ensuring that nobody is left out, we do need some centralized, a centralized utility which is able to play that role. And that for me is an important argument, in addition to the ones Sean has outlined, about why we need a national utility. You know, renewable energy, setting up a small renewable energy project is expensive. It needs resources. It needs know-how. It needs commitment to ongoing maintenance, etc., etc. And I think if we kind of think we're going to leave that to communities' self-organization to do that, I think we might end up with a kind of a neoliberal understanding of what it means to have community empowerment. And actually what it does is it's kind of undermining, or it's taking away the important role that the state should be playing in ensuring that there's access to electricity. So for me, then we need to do a lot more work on how national utilities and municipalities, some of which are cities and some of which are not cities, can work together to deal with the problem of energy access. And that might mean in some areas, some rural areas, some informal settlements, it might mean that, you know, setting up embedded generation, mini grids, etc. But that needs to be done with some kind of central oversight to make sure that no communities are being left out in that process. I just also wanted to say that I strongly agree with the kind of criticism of the notion of a prosumer. I think we really should be avoiding the use of terms which emphasize the commodification of electricity. So in the same way, I actually think we shouldn't talk about electricity customers. Customer is somebody who goes inside a shop and buys a loaf of bread, not somebody who pays for electricity, because electricity is a basic service, and it should be provided as a public good, not as a commercial good. I think, okay, so that's talking about the importance of kind of a partnership or an agreement between national and local for ensuring access to electricity. I think in terms of reducing carbon emissions, both again have to play a vital role in that process, with national utilities taking the lead in that process, but in partnership with cities. And I think we really need to emphasize the importance of that partnership, that agreement between the different levels at which renewable energy can be generated. You know, the city of Cape Town took the energy regulator and the minister to court over the right to enter into power purchase agreements with independent power producers. And when they first did that, you know, a lot of people thought that that was a wonderful idea, because finally it would increase the amount of renewable energy, you know, being used, etc. But all that does, when a city enters into a power purchase agreement with an IPP, is it replicates the very privatization that we are resisting at a national level. The city also can't enter into, you know, the city of Cape Town can't enter into any IPPs bigger than about 300 megawatts, because to go bigger, it's difficult for the financing. They're not going to get, you know, they won't have the guarantees, etc. So cities can't enter into those kind of agreements without the national oversight. But we don't want cities to be doing IPPs. We want, if cities are going to look at the possibility of generating, it should be as doing it themselves. When we look at sort of reducing carbon emissions, it's also just important to remember the other kinds of roles that cities can play in the process. Around energy efficiency measures, public transport, etc. So those are also important parts of the whole decarbonization debate that needs to take place. I think at the end of the day, and maybe I'll just finish off here, I think the massive problem we have is keeping renewable energy as a public good in the public sector. I think what we've seen in Africa, you know, there's been little full privatization of energy in Africa, but lots of corporatization and commercialization of utilities. But I think what we've seen over the years with renewable energy is renewable energy has been used in many cases to effectively start the process of privatizing the energy sector in many countries, because there seems to be a kind of an acceptance that renewable energy is something different from fossil fuel generated electricity, and therefore it's okay for it to be done through the private sector. So I think our massive problem is keeping renewable energy public, as a public good. And I think the huge challenge that we face moving forward is working out you know, in different contexts, in different countries, in different situations, how the technical possibilities that renewable energy opens up, in that it can be done on a small scale, it can be done at utility level, it can be done through embedded generation, how we ensure that those that the national utility is the driver for renewable energy, but that it's being done in a way which works in partnership with other possibilities, technical possibilities, with the ultimate aim of ensuring access to electricity, you know, for fundamentally the working class who have most need of electricity at an affordable price. So I'll stop there.
Great, Sandra. Thank you so much for those comments. Yes, an emphasis on partnerships with an overall decommodified system, and with the utilities driving the process to plan for access and decarbonization. So thank you for those, and we look forward to the discussion with you. We're going to move on to hear from Lavinia Stenfort. She is the Economic Justice Program staff member with Transnational Institute. Lavinia has done a lot of work and research on community energy and municipalities. As most of you know, TNI has been a great ally and partner with TUED, working on a number of reports, including the ESCOM Transformed report that Sean was referring to. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Lavinia and her intervention. So over to you.
Hi, thanks, Irene and Sean. Am I clear now because of earlier audio issues? Great. Okay. Yeah, it's really great to be here and hearing the previous interventions. And yeah, we are really proud of our collaboration with TUED and the amazing work that Sean, John, Irene, that you all are doing. So let me just share what I wanted to say, which is, yeah, trying not to repeat the great arguments, which we very much agree as TNI, but to really also, yeah, look a bit towards the future, because, yeah, we agree utilities are definitely the beating heart of many energy systems, and they have to be transformed into democratic public utilities to urgently move away from the current energy expansion and towards just transitions. However, for many climate and energy groups, this is indeed far from evident. But how did that happen, and how can we overcome this? So I will address a few points, hopefully to strengthen and expand the Energy Democracy Alliance efforts, discussing first energy literacy, then essential energy use, and third democratization, as I think this should be the interface between communities and utilities, and finally how solidarity can help us overcome this kind of big versus small dichotomy. So first of all, the liberalization and privatization of utilities have not only fragmented the value chain, these processes have made it ever more difficult to grasp which elements make up the energy system. As such, many policymakers, let alone social movements, have often little clue indeed what functions are core to running an energy system. So indeed, as has been said, we do need a much better understanding of the technicalities and which functions utilities fulfill for a real progressive overhaul of just transition policy. But how can we also fight for public utilities when a country doesn't have one anymore? And I know this is not the case everywhere, but it is the case in some places. And when also people cannot even imagine why we need a public and integrated energy system, which is in many countries, very unfortunately, the situation. So for one, I think we have to take account of the energy histories of every particular country and really meet people where they're at. So to give an example, For the benefit of Dutch energy and climate movements, TNI did a report last year on the failure of Dutch power markets, showing what the public energy system from before privatization looked like. So it had 4 public power producers that coordinated everything from fuel choice to generation capacity to power transmission. And then we argue that the entire power sector needs to be reclaimed from the market and multinationals like Vattenfall for the transition to take off, let alone succeed. In parallel, though, the energy transition debate is already very saturated with technical jargon. This depoliticizes the discussion and fragments social movements. For example, the fight against energy poverty cannot be separated from the necessity of public ownership, even though these movements have far too little contact. Free markets and the utility focus on profit, corporatized utility focus on profit, fundamentally inhibits tackling energy poverty at its root. Now, with the raging energy crisis, it's really up to us to lead the debate away from capitalist technocrats and ally with working people on energy literacy. Without this, there will be no mass movements to force governments towards the public utilities needed for a democratic transition. Moreover, I do think it bears mention that energy technocracies, as we have them, are deeply gendered. Not only are women, as in women workers, generally excluded from energy governance, the technocratization risks an overfocus of the amount of kilowatt hour that needs to be produced. Not saying this isn't important, but I do think we should first and foremost address energy as a life source, treating it as a human right and responsibility in order to significantly reduce and change how we use kilowatt hours. I think this means prioritizing essential energy usage needed for social reproduction and having more honest conversation about how certain industries should be changed, repurposed, if not wound down completely. Though surely to guarantee justice, industry workers, trade unions, and communities have to be in the lead, with the rest of society having their back. So yes, governments need to speed up the energy transition, start generating renewable public power, and fully make use of the potential and the roles that utilities play, but the need for energy conservation cannot be stressed enough. So not only are there simply not enough transition minerals to make the current world economy go round on renewables, US and Europe capitalist elites have a huge climate debt to the rest of the world, and to stop this debt from growing, as it's responsible for the climate crisis in the first place, we do need to deprivatize, democratize, and decolonize utilities. This means fighting the foreign trade policies like presented in the recent Repower EU leaks that grabs hydrogen in other regions, allowing colonial capitalism as usual. Instead, for global just transitions, public energy systems in the global north should really urgently reduce their use by putting working people first and profits last. Then I do think it's risky to discuss small transition efforts, whether energy citizenship, energy communities, as the problem. Many collectives are simply trying to change the energy model as much as is within their means, be it indeed within the current market framework. And I agree that this strategy is severely limited, as such efforts can easily go bust, as happened with energy cooperatives in Germany and municipal companies in the UK. But at the same time, local alternatives are not the root of the problem. And I think we do agree, but market policies, corporate power, capitalist states are the real culprits, enabling profiteering, unfair competition, and ultimately oligopolies. So instead of brushing aside local solutions as distractions, we should get them on board by showing how utilities and communities are fundamentally interdependent. Because local transitions can surely only triumph when energy systems and their utilities are public, democratic, and cooperative. Just like utilities cannot meet their public mission without meeting the basic energy needs of each and every community. Thus, in order for public utilities to enter or re-enter people's imagination, which is a prerequisite for building social movements, we have to make more noise about how an integrated public energy system, far beyond any neoliberal prosumers model, which was already mentioned, can benefit users, democratize decision-making, provide progressive tariffs, and guarantee basic universal energy provision. For this reason, TNI is currently investigating how Costa Rica's energy utility, or electricity utility ISE, is cooperating with regional, municipal, and cooperative entities, and through that is much better equipped to transition and ensure affordability in times of climate and energy crisis, looking deeper into its mandate, its mission, its investment strategies, and the international market pressures that are growing. But then let's also acknowledge that for utilities to democratize and share decision-making power with users, there is a whole lot to be learned from municipalities. As pointed out in our ongoing remunicipalization database, publicfutures.org, and the Empower project that enabled 100 or more European local authorities to peer learn from each other for a fair, clean, and democratic energy praxis. So just very briefly, take the public company Barcelona Energia, whose users council monitors municipal measures, makes strategic proposals, and participates in decisions on tariffs and investments, or the electricity utility of the German town Wolfhagen that is co-owned by the citizen cooperative, improving decision-making, and with that the local energy transition policy. While the city of Plymouth is equitably collaborating with its local energy collective, developing energy efficiency and renewable projects for and with the benefit of all residents. So to really be clear, this is not to say that these examples are perfect, nor that we should limit ourselves to the local level, which is a claim often made. Indeed, the opposite is the point here. We have to just acknowledge that public energy systems are public in as much as they are democratic. And we cannot ignore these attempts to democratize energy locally if we want to organize and get to build social majorities for public energy futures on a utility level. Also, one situation to recall, US presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' support for full public power over the entire electricity system actually should have been understood as the pinnacle of a growing number of energy citizen campaigns from San Francisco to Minnesota that successfully pushed their local authorities to provide public power from renewable sources. So popular pressure from across US localities were actually a precondition for many social movements to put public power on the national agenda. So I'm wrapping up here, but just to make a few last remarks. We do have to acknowledge also that in many contexts the utility is predominantly serving more urbanized areas, and that the grid is not reaching, or worse, extracting from rural lands and communities. In those situations, extending the grid versus decentralization might not be the most social and environmentally sound solution, or what kind of grid can combine centralization and autonomy in order to improve the resilience in the event of utility disruptive climate disasters? And how can we account for the fact that decentralized energy is generally more efficient, with lots of power being lost when transporting it over long distances? I think all the arguments, obviously, from Sean and John and so on still stand, but we do have to reckon with these dimensions. So yes, obviously it's almost impossible for many cities to become self-sufficient. It still makes sense to maximize local generation and conservation, putting public solar powers on all surfaces, developing local heat and cooling supplies in cities is clearly preferable to grabbing lands for solar and wind that violates the rights of indigenous and other rural communities. And especially the heating and cooling is a major source of energy use. So there is much more to say on that. Also the large scale project more easily have been producing extractivism. So we cannot allow rural to urban exploitation, and instead should acknowledge that reversing the exploitative power relation across the rural to urban spectrum is needed by building practices that are grounded in emancipatory rural politics that are often discarded. And I also think we have to reckon with the situations where grid connections enable capital accumulation and entrenched extractivism, as is the case in Morocco, but also many other countries. And wherever utility scale projects have the free, prior informed consent of peoples living on site, the entire life cycle of the project should be co-developed by them, prioritizing first and foremost their needs and livelihoods. And of course, at the same time, taking into account the bigger energy and climate crisis situation. So to conclude, I think based on all this, instead of approaching the problem as big versus small, let's reframe this discussion as a matter of energy solidarity. For public democratic, and planned energy system should focus on reversing unjust power relations and treating energy as an essential need that can combine solidarity with collective sufficiency and self-determination. This might be our last chance to divert us away from colonial capitalism and towards the globally just energy transitions we need. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Lavinia. That was a very rich and deep analysis and some really interesting ideas, including how to center a feminist agenda, ideas of conservationism, and including, completely winding down certain industries or aspects of modern day life, issues of extractivism, and ideas of really how to think about interfacing utilities and communities. So yes, I really look forward to our continued discussion after the next speaker. Thank you for your intervention. Let's see, next we are going to hear from Sam Mason. Sam is the political officer of Public and Commercial Services in the UK. Sam is a longtime ally and part of the network of TUED, and was one of the participants that helped draft the trade union program for a public low carbon energy future, and has been in this space for a long time. So we really look forward to hearing from you, Sam. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Irene. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Yeah, all right, I sound very muffled in my head, but okay. Firstly, just thanks to Sean, John, TUED team, as usual, for another excellent paper. And I think for me personally has been really helpful in setting out the arguments so clearly and really encapsulating what Sandra, I think, importantly referred to around the different realities, because I think we have to sort of read this in our context, and perhaps the discussion is really about how we bring this together in a coherent narrative as a sort of TUED project on the global scale. But so a lot of my focus is going to be the UK, quite obviously. But I firstly just want to say, because it's PCS annual conference this week, and yesterday there was unanimous endorsement for the Global Trade Union Programme that Irene just mentioned, and to actively promote this within the union and wider labour movement. So while PCS had obviously already signed up to the programme at its launch at the COP last year, I think it's really important nonetheless to have that clear mandate from our conference to now institutionalise this within our campaigning and industrial agenda. And it's good and coincidence the timing of this TUED meeting, which also coincided with our fringe meeting we had last night at conference on the energy and cost of living crisis, because I think we do have to situate this debate within that crisis that we're facing at the moment. And it's good to be reminded of that, particularly because in the UK, we're suffering some of the worst hit from the current energy crisis across Europe. That won't be a surprise, obviously, to those who understand the wholly privatised and liberalised nature of our energy system. The eye-watering profits of the energy companies, whether in generation or our literal kick in the face to millions who are now set to face fuel poverty for the first time. These are working people, including many PCS members, and we heard lots of testimony to this in our conference this week, who are struggling on the top of rising food costs, transport, housing costs, etc., because it all feeds into that. Obviously, that isn't unique to the UK, but as I said, some elements of our energy system are perhaps more unique. For example, you see the price caps in France at 4% compared to what is happening here. And therefore the debate that's coming out of that, which is largely centered on this notion of a windfall tax on energy companies, and the broad political discussion is almost as though there's little that can be done about this, and some arguments coming in around nationalisation, and just say that the UK Chancellor has now just announced a 5 billion windfall tax on energy companies. So this is just the oil and gas companies. Politically, that's no surprise. I think we saw that coming with events here. But I wanted to mention why this links back to the paper, and because it's unfortunately in the midst of this crisis now, there are few spaces that are raising the issue of the neoliberal framework of our energy system, regardless of the role of incumbent energy companies and what they're playing. And I think this, whilst we had that sort of blip at the Labour Party manifesto, which was obviously very welcome in 2019, despite some of the limitations that Sean has referred to, the Labour Party policy has now totally walked away from that, the current Labour Party. But even if we go back to 1997 and the Blairite years, who also introduced this notion of windfall taxes, they were still intent on keeping the liberalised, privatised utilities and energy system. They just wanted to bring more social aspects to it and to ensure that the poorest didn't get the hardest hit by it. And unfortunately, we're still kind of stuck in that paradigm, if you like. But I think the other important thing, and for me, which I think was so welcome in this paper around the distributed generation side, because a lot of the discussion, and perhaps not unsurprisingly, are focusing now around growing moves towards community ownership or cooperative models and the ideas of community wealth building. And this is something that very much came up in our discussion at our PCS Fringe meeting last night. And as I said, it's understandable in a context of the crisis we're in, because people are looking for very practical ways to address the energy and climate crisis, where they see the government reneging on commitments made just six months ago at the COP. That's almost kind of forgotten now. But I thought it was interesting because going to a very micro level, one example of a new initiative that was highlighted to me last night is actually happening in my very neighbourhood, and I wasn't aware of it. It's a new project called Power, which is taking one street to link mass participation art, cooperatively owned energy, and a documentary film which aims to move residents from being consumers to cooperative producers of energy. And the idea is to sell the art to raise the money to buy solar panels, and for each house that participates would get solar panels on their house. Obviously, it's been told it will lessen their energy bills. But the big sort of core around this, it's infrastructure as resistance and power. So it's seen as a very progressive move and a street level Green New Deal. And the aim of this would be that it would be replicated right across the country, and street by street, we scale up on this basis. Now, yeah, tens of thousands of streets in London. This is quite an incredible ambition. And just the other one to come to community wealth building, which I think many of you on this call have heard a bit about over the past few years as an initiative in the UK, which we've largely seen as a positive initiative in the absence of the kind of political agenda that we want, or political basis of power. But in North Ayrshire, for example, in Scotland, a progressive Labour council is developing models of municipal ownership in retrofitting solar panels and renewable energy for local benefit, meeting social and decarbonisation aims, something they're referring to as place-based socialism. Again, that would appear quite welcome, but I think we have to see this also in the context. There's a community wealth building bill that's just going through the Scottish Parliament. Now, if you start to dig down into that, this isn't about a comprehensive reclaiming of our energy system. This is about public-private partnerships, third way and community sector building as well. So it's not talking or getting to the things that obviously we're trying to develop within the TUED programme. And I think this goes to one of the problems of this kind of decentralised but very popular big society or energy citizenship generation, which fails to address the fundamental technical economic coordination issues of energy transition, which has obviously been talked about, which the paper speaks to, and unwittingly, no doubt, this language of resistance in power is not really going to that depth of analysis about the system and the wider politics and free market logic of the energy system. And I think just to go back to where these ideas of big society come from, some may recall this was a notion of David Cameron when he was leader of the Tory party, but it's a rooted Tory concept in the UK, which links free market ideology with social solidarity, and similar to the Blairite third way politics of volunteerism, rather than public services, rather than wider public ownership. And I think, you know, it talks about some of this in the paper, and that's absolutely the trap that we start to get into when we see this street level initiative as being very progressive, but not actually seeing where it just plays into this whole agenda of the neoliberal system. And of course, doesn't address the technical issues. And I just want to highlight, there was an article in the Financial Times at the beginning of this month where renewable projects in the UK, so these are not obviously community projects, but big projects, that they reckon they are facing a 10-year wait to connect to the electricity grid. That's projects that are ready to go. So I think, you know, that just highlights again some of the problems with this, and addressing ownership issues within a socialism in one place obviously doesn't deal with the scale and limits not just to decarbonize, but socialization of energy and everything related to that around transport, housing, and of course worker just transition issues, for example. So I don't disagree, and I think I saw a comment in the chat about, you know, I don't think it's a question of not having distributed energy, because I think in a way we want new homes built with solar panels on, we want to use every space that we can, but we have to recognize that within a comprehensive system and a planned system as well. So I think what all this does talk to is all the points about planning and the comprehensive reclaiming of the whole electricity system. And certainly we agree with that from PCS Trade Union. The question is how we shift that position. But for me, that has to be part of our industrial policy objectives in putting forward our energy transition alternative programme, which is linked to energy conservation as well, and addressing issues within the built environment, and of course promoting mass public transit, etc. And I think just to finish up, I mean, PCS, we have long supported the climate jobs campaign, which obviously is not just in the UK, in South Africa and other places, where jobs are created under a public works programme directly to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And faced with the announcements in our own union of 91,000 job cuts, which was announced in the press, not directly to our representatives, I think it's become even more imperative or critical for us to start to concretely discuss building the National Climate Service that has been at the heart of that climate jobs programme, and defining what that looks like, because this is what we believe is going to be central to developing the kind of planning that we need as part of overthrowing the neoliberal energy transition to one where we have under public ownership, under the comprehensive reclaiming that links the municipal initiatives and other decentralized initiatives, and it's a genuine social and democratic forms of involvement in the energy system at a local level. And also to revisit the concept that we talked about in PCS within our Energy Democracy and Just Transition pamphlet in 2017 around a real worker public partnership, and how we start to build that. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sam, for your comments, your intervention. Yes, and pointing out the trappings of how community wealth building ideas end up sitting in neoliberal agendas and end up reinforcing those. And the various examples, particularly from the UK, that you've just raised. So thanks so much, all of the respondents. I think what we're going to do now is open up the conversation for everybody and try to have a bit of a discussion for the next 15 minutes. I see, Daria, your hand. Do you want to come in? And I think I have some things to share from you. I can find it.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I don't want to put the video on, if I may, because it's actually public holidays here, and I'm calling you. I'm following the call from home. Anyway, thanks a lot, Irene. Thanks, Sean and TUED for having. Can you just wait before I ask you to put that up? I sent something to Irene because I'm not in the office, so I need some assistance, but I wanted to use an image to make a point. So hi everyone, Daria Cibrario from Public Services International. I'm very concerned with anything which is subnational, municipal and regional, because I run the local government services department, if I may call it as such, at PSI. So let me just first of all welcome this big piece of work that TUED has launched on cities. We were aware that this was coming, so that's very welcome and positive. And there's a lot of important points that are made in there. I also want to highlight a number of the key points that were made by the respondents, and notably by Sandra and Lavinia, but also, of course, by Sam. And I do encourage the authors of the paper to really take on board quite inclusively these remarks, because I really think they're going to be key also to enrich the public energy program that we've been working together over the past almost the whole year. And that dimension may be added, I would suggest, to that piece of work. So let me just recap very briefly what I think are the pieces or the key concepts that should be incorporated in this analysis of comprehensive reclaiming versus local energy initiatives. The first point I want to make is that has already been made, is precisely that I think the target in a way is slightly off. I wouldn't see the conflict being between comprehensive reclaiming and remunicipalization, or between centralized approach to energy policies or decentralized. It is between publicly owned and publicly led policies in energy and neoliberal policies, be them advanced at a central or local government level. The point on having disruptive approaches to energy policy may have been embraced by some parts of what is called progressive municipalist movement, but that is not necessarily only there. There's actually a lot of neoliberal urbanism and municipalism that is actually pushing much more for that. And I believe that those who are real progressive municipalists fully understand that energy by its very nature requires a national policy framework. So for me, the focus that perhaps is missing in this paper, and we would all collectively benefit from developing that aspect, is the governance, is the policy governance, or you can call it industrial policy frameworks that underpin energy systems. And I think a second point I want to make, and perhaps Irene, if you can show that picture that you put up in a moment, is what Sandra von Niekerk also said. We must be careful not to equate cities with local and territories. Because if you see that picture, I just picked France because France has a centralized policy in energy, and it still has a publicly owned, at least majority owned public utility, which generates energy with a different mix. So I'm taking France because it has centralized policy on energy, but also in a way a centralized public utility, which the French unions are fighting for very fiercely to keep. But look at how the distribution, production, generation, and storage of energy is distributed on the territory. So just forget the cities, look at the territories. So any kind of public service requires a point of use which is local, or a point of generation and transmission which goes through territories. So by its inherent nature, there is a local dimension to any national energy policy and any national public utility. So this is perhaps through the picture we can kind of visualize something that we've actually talked about a number of times with Sean and John. Yeah, and the next one is actually similar, it just shows how, for instance, renewable energies, and here there's a lot of private operators, even in France, which come into the picture. But beyond being private or public, you have this territorial dimension to energy policy. So I do encourage to look more carefully, or with careful attention, at the governance system, so that we can do what previous speakers suggested, is to put forward a proposal where the different levels of government, but also communities, can actually work hand in hand to reclaim comprehensively energy policies and energy utilities, which inevitably will have repercussions and implications on the territories. Last point, I think it is absolutely necessary that we do not always equate local energy initiatives with community energy initiatives. They're two different things, precisely because of the map that I showed earlier. Any national utility in energy has local plans, and therefore we cannot just say that anything municipal in terms of energy, or anything regional or departmental or state energy generation in federal states, or in the United States, in Australia, is community energy. These are two different dimensions. And lastly, the point on access. Of course, we need to continue to aspire at a comprehensive, public, democratic, accountable utilities that are national. But where there's still a lack of infrastructure, basic infrastructure in many developing countries, we cannot just condemn, or we cannot just point the finger saying you should not go into setting up whatever you can set up just to have access to basic energy. Of course, we need a much better solution, especially at the time of absolute climate emergency and crisis and implosion of our system. But in any case, we must be wary of the equitable access to energy that some of these initiatives may represent, where there's a total lack of public infrastructure. Thank you very much, and sorry for having been very long. Thank you.
Thanks, Daria. That was great. Yeah, that was great. The maps are really also helpful in understanding a little bit of thinking about infrastructure and the connections between the region, state, national, and local levels. Yes, I can share the maps if that's okay with you. It seems like some people want them. I wanted to ask Colin, because you had put in a comment earlier and then one here, if you wanted to come in, because I think it'd be good to hear from you, especially with some of your experiences with Australia. And
thanks, Irene, and thanks everyone. The comments and presentations have been excellent, and I thought Daria's contribution then was really good as well. Look, I agree with most of what Sean said and the paper presents, but I think there is one thing that we're not really taking into account and which we dismiss far too easily around community energy, and that is consciousness building. The reality is that and I made a comment about neoliberalism. I'm going to use neoliberalism maybe a bit broadly here myself, but the reality is that neoliberalism over 40 years has effectively destroyed so much of the functioning of the democratic, sort of social democratic state, that the idea that we could simply take utilities back into some sort of meaningful democratic public ownership without a whole process of building consciousness in people to enable that to occur, I think is rather fanciful. And that one of the things that community energy does and community wealth building does is actually introduces a form of consciousness that is radically opposed to neoliberalism and that gets people thinking about concepts of cooperation, of non-market behaviour and so on, that I think is vital to the whole process of transforming the state into some sort of democratic governance, because it's nowhere near it now. And if we were to just to renationalise electricity utilities into this current state, I don't think they would be even vaguely democratic. So that's probably my main point. That there's really something about consciousness building that we haven't quite picked up, and I think is really important to community energy. And what I'll also say is, I don't know anyone, I do a lot of work around community type stuff, but I don't know anyone who thinks, maybe there are some, but I don't know anyone who truly thinks you can run an electricity system on decentralized renewable energy. It needs to be a combination of large scale, publicly owned renewables, but also community and even household level energy. I think we need all of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Yes, really important point about organizing and consciousness raising, and how these systems of community energy and community wealth building can help in the process of transforming people's understanding of systems. Okay, Daniel Chavez, have you come in?
Yes, I just wanted to offer two footnotes to the excellent presentations provided by all the speakers. The first one has to do with the fact that many of the processes we are discussing now are not really new. And many of the trends that appear really new from a northern perspective, at least in the global south, had been there for many years. For instance, my colleague Lavinia mentioned the case of Costa Rica, which is a very interesting example of a combination of a national public utility that covers the whole country, that works in partnership with two municipal, well, one municipal and one metropolitan public enterprises, and 4 cooperatives. But this is a system that was created over 50 years ago. And there are several other examples in Latin America and in other parts of the global south where public utilities have been in the forefront, in the vanguard of the transition towards renewable. I can talk about my own country, Uruguay, but there are examples of other places in Latin America where state-owned, national state-owned enterprises are engaged in this kind of transition. The other footnote has to do with the role and significance of municipalities. We have to be aware that many countries of the global south, municipalities are not really local or regional governments, are more local administration that have very little authority to plan, design, implement policies of their own. For instance, now in Chile with the new national government, there's a very interesting discussion about the role of that municipalities could play in the provision of public services, more in general, not only energy, but also including energy. But that's quite unthinkable in the current institutional framework, because municipalities are not really governments, are more local administration that are very much subordinated to the national state and have little money, little political autonomy, little authority to implement policies of their own.
Great, thanks, Daniel, for bringing in that dimension, highlighting, well, bringing in the dimension of the Global South and the slightly different set of conditions, and also just the reality of a lot of these local governments and the inability to have more control over and say over decision making. Yeah, it'd be really good to look more into some of these other examples, as you mentioned, Uruguay and Costa Rica that Lavinia mentioned. I'm wondering if any of the, oh, I see we're at 9:30. Oh my goodness. Okay, how did that happen? I'm just wondering if any of the respondents or Sean wants to come back in and just say maybe another word or two. I did ask the interpreters if they could stay a little bit longer, so maybe we can have another few minutes here and then wrap up. And if none of you want to say anything, then we can close out, but there is opportunity to say a few more things.
I'd like to come back quickly, if that's okay.
Yes, please do.
First of all, I really appreciate the interventions and from comrades on who are listed on the agenda, and also Colin and Daria and others who came into the discussion, and Daniel. I think there are a lot of points were made, and the goal of the paper was, well, there are a couple of things. One was to try to unpack the issues around cities and their ambition and their claims of what they're going to do, and to sort of point to what is really I would say a neoliberal agenda, but of course neoliberal is an imperfect term and doesn't explain all the layers and the different changes over the years in that idea. Because I felt there was, and I think I'm speaking for John and Irene as well, that the utilities were just never really discussed. I mean, they provide like 80–90% of electricity of the developed world and increase and similar amounts in the underdeveloped world, if that's a right term these days. But there seems that a lot of left opinion, not necessarily trade union opinion, had moved towards the idea that cities were the point of struggle and much could be achieved. And that is true. But the power systems are often national systems. Electricity is peculiar in that respect, that electrons have to move long distances, and where are the decisions made. So the idea of comprehensive reclaiming was to say that to really move towards a different energy system would require control and ownership of generation, transmission, distribution, and also supply chains leading into those three areas. It wasn't, there was no intention to say that to relegate municipal struggles to something that was an afterthought or a distraction. We did point out in earlier working papers that some of the advocates of community energy are very comfortable with the idea of market liberalization, as long as they can get a piece of the action politically and some protections from the market. They're fine with it. And we felt that we were confronting that with the work of TUED time and time and again, that we had to put forward arguments that led to the whole debate around comprehensive reclaiming around the British Labour Party, because it was that statement that came out of the Labour Party, despite its many positives, would have been extremely problematical if they become government and tried to implement it. It would have caused problems. And we see similar things around the world, around similar issues. But all of the points made by others, I think they've enriched the discussion. And I would encourage comrades to keep writing about it. I mean, even if it's a discussion that is pulling apart the working paper and, you know, and interrogating every point, I think that would raise the level of all of us. The paper was long, it was complicated, and it really only scratches the surface. And there are a lot of things that would be written differently even a year later had we had the sort of knowledge and discussion that we've had today, which has contributed to it. I neglected to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for publishing the paper. They've been, you know, absolutely stalwart allies of ours and do great work in keeping getting TUED's message out into the trade union community. And the last point I would make is on the access question. I think there's a whole discussion that needs to be had there. This was a paper about how reclaimed municipalities could help cities reach their climate targets, but the access question is hugely important, particularly in the global south, but increasingly, I think, in the north as well. And here's a little factoid that I think would come into that discussion. You know, the idea of sort of off-grid solar solutions in the global south was 10 years ago was being promoted as an alternative to firm grid-based power, which was driven by gas, coal, and nuclear. And if we look at the data in recent years of electrification in places like India and Bangladesh, where literally hundreds of millions of people have gained access in the last 10 years, it's all fossil fuels, almost 100%. Bangladesh in particular, 50 million people have been connected, and renewables are virtually invisible. And I don't say that with any satisfaction. The off-grid solar solutions were promoted by the World Bank. They drove poor families into more debt because they had to pay back the loans. It was a ridiculous system. And so whether we're talking about the potential of distributed generation, the potential of microgrids, et cetera, then it's a political as much as it's a technical task as much as a political one. And I think we've only just begun to get into those subjects within the TUED community. But that's why we have these forums, so we can learn from each other and share ideas, and sometimes agree and sometimes disagree, and it's all good. So I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Sean. A bunch of really other excellent comments are coming through in the chat. I don't think we have time to go through them, but we'll leave the Zoom open if people want to read through and engage. I don't know if any of the other respondents want to come in for one last word, but just a minute. Doesn't seem like it. Okay. If you do, unmute yourself and just say so. Okay. I can't see you, so. All right, everybody.
Sorry, just
yes,
quickly.
Please.
Reading Colin's and Daniel's comments, totally agree. And I think the challenge is to now start doing kind of really in-depth, almost case study, country-based research, which is already happening, but on how how we can build a system which combines national and local initiatives, you know, in a way that meets all the kind of criteria we've been talking about. So that's all I'd finish with.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to end on, Sandra. So thanks for bringing that to the forefront. I think we're all in agreement that we recognize the public framing as critical, and we absolutely want communities and people in local spaces to be involved, and we want a different kind of public system that's democratic and has inputs and that, you know, transforms the dynamics of the kind of oppressive system we have now. So we'll leave it there. Jen, I know you wanted to come in, unless you had like a one-word thing to say.
I was just intrigued with the presentation of Sean. What does it mean of disruption? Because that's the current dispensation of a regulated system in the power industry. What is happening in our country, instead of just transition, it's business expansion of the same corporate fossil-based fuel generation company, and they lower their costs and encroach into the distribution utilities, in particular the electric cooperatives, which is consumer-owned. So, and there is a recent Supreme Court decision that these private corporations can expropriate the facilities and equipment of the electric cooperatives. And we are on a defensive position, not only in the power industry, but politically. We lost the election. That's it. I agree with Sian, but I am intrigued. What does it mean of disruption of the normal, regulated system, and how can we, put it in advance? Lowering the cost of electricity. That's the people and the consumers wants, and addressing energy poverty and transition towards renewable energy. That's all. My point. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you for coming in at the end. All right, everybody, I think we are at time. If you want to unmute yourself, and I'm coming off spotlight. So if people want to unmute yourself and say goodbye, thanks for this really rich discussion. Thanks so much to all of the respondents and for the other interventions of people that came in
Hasta
on the
luego.
floor.
Y gracias a la traducción.
Yeah.
Gracias.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Thanks again.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas
Thanks
gracias.
to the interpreters.